Welcome back to the target stream for MINTPRESS News. I'm your host, Robert Inlakesh. As always, thank you to everyone for joining us. Iran has reportedly issued an ultimatum to the United States: either end your blockade and return to the table for serious negotiations or face all-out war. Meanwhile, Israel has failed yet again to seize more territory in South Lebanon, instead facing an ambush that hit a special forces unit they had deployed to take the strategic al-Taher Hills area. We'll look into all of this, accusations of a false flag attack in Iraq, and the battlefield in Yemen also. But before we begin, the target stream is 100% viewer funded. In the last 2 years, we were targeted and banned by PayPal, and our fundraisers were taken down by Indiegogo and GoFundMe. They even withheld our funds. So we are looking for 300 new members to keep this show alive. You can join MINTPRESS on Patreon or right here on YouTube and join our membership program. So lots to get into today. The battlefield in South Lebanon looks like it is once again uniting. There's a video that was released by Lebanese Hezbollah that appears to issue a very clear threat. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at what has been happening in terms of the US and its failed attempt to disarm all of the allies of Iran in the region, what that means, potentially a false flag attack, and a lot more, of course. So first things first, Iran has, according to Reuters, their sources, communicated to the United States via Pakistan and Qatar, this is according to Reuters, that they will go on the offensive in the Strait of Hormuz if diplomacy fails with the US. And basically what they've laid out is that if the US does not end its blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, then they are going to attack targets. And perhaps we're hearing a lot in the way of a preemptive attack from the Iranians, which I believe at this stage is not off the table. It makes a lot of sense for Iran to engage in some kind of defensive action. But it does look like the US may be trying to set up Iran as well. And we'll go into that a little bit more. But the US being the US, it's threatening to bomb everyone, of course. So Oman, this is the second time now that Donald Trump has threatened to bomb it because, of course, Oman was negotiating with Iran to find a solution in the Strait of Hormuz for two different routes to pass through the strategic waterway. Trump originally sold this as if he was part of these negotiations and that Iran was negotiating with the United States, and that's why he called off his strikes that he threatened against Iranian civilian infrastructure, which would, of course, opened up a massive regional war. And it appeared as if the United States were just looking for an excuse to back out of having to do this. So he's not very happy at the fact that Oman has negotiated with Iran. Like Iran publicly commented, these negotiations had nothing to do with the United States. But of course, the United States involves itself in this case, again, threatening to bomb its own ally, which is sort of in character for Trump. It's not something out of the ordinary at all. Meanwhile, the US president has been talking about how strong his position is. We'll take a look at that and then take a look at the reality of what's actually happening on the ground in the Strait of Hormuz today. Of course, Iran has been taking out ships in the Strait of Hormuz constantly on a daily basis, sometimes multiple ships a day. We're going to look at what's happened today. But first, here's Trump earlier.
Effective. And, we're taking out, now maybe that will stop or maybe it'll open up even further, but we're taking out millions of barrels of oil a week. If you look at the kind of numbers that we're doing, the strait is open and the oil prices are coming down and they will continue to come down unless we decide to do something far more drastic than we're doing. Iran is in big trouble.
Yes, Iran is in big trouble. He's claiming that the oil prices were coming down. However, there's news that an Emirati tanker was not just struck in the Strait of Hormuz, but near Qashm Island here. As you can see up there, sort of blocked a little bit by that key that's pulled up there. But next to Qashm Island, an Emirati ship was seized. Initially, we heard reports that it was disabled, but then Iranian media reported that they had seized the ship. So this is a significant escalation. And as a result, those oil prices that Trump loves to brag about shot up past $90 per barrel for Brent crude futures, which, of course, as we've spoken about on the show before, can be manipulated. This is a game that the United States has played. And this is Trump right now, Baghdad Bob. Everything's fine. There's no problems. So throwback here to the Iraq War, if anyone remembers. But that's basically Donald Trump at this moment. He's very clearly incapable of changing anything on the ground. And so he's making threats left, right, and center. I don't believe that he really knows what's going on, because if he did, perhaps he'd be blurting out a lot more. I think they just feed him information just to keep him happy here and there. He can't pull the trigger on any decision because, of course, he can't go against the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby wants this war to continue. It's a war for Israel. There has been an absolute disaster, of course, on the USS Abraham Lincoln. And this has come out in a very embarrassing way for the Trump administration. We've heard over the past weeks all of the munitions that the U.S. drained in its initial 40-day period of war fighting the Iranians. We know now for a fact that since another MQ-9 drone was shot out of the skies late last week, Iran has destroyed roughly more than 25% of the US's MQ-9 Reaper drones. And this means over $1 billion, I think $1.3 billion worth of drones have been destroyed. The long-range precision missiles of the United States, their stockpiles are dwindling. Their air defense munitions as well have been cut down. In the case of the THAAD system, which is the most sophisticated anti-ballistic missile system, some 80% of the stockpile of those munitions have been depleted. So the US is not in a great position. And as that has been happening, we've seen that on the Yemen front, we'll take a look at this. Now, Yemen has been blasting not only the Saudi proxy forces inside of Yemen, but also Saudi Arabia, and keeping up with its counter blockade on the Saudis. So it's been targeting a few key sites. We'll take a look at these just on a map here. So the Mukha port here has been targeted on a number of occasions. And it appears as if, as well, there was an advance that happened briefly. Some more towns were captured by Yemen's Ansarullah forces, the government forces. So the Yemeni armed forces have been making advances. This port as well was considered, at least temporarily, non-operational because of the missile strikes against it. And this has presented a major problem for, of course, the supply of weapons to the Saudi proxies. Now, all of this, of course, is a big deal because Saudi Arabia is being forced to either try and smuggle some of its oil through the Suez Canal in the northern Red Sea area, or other than that, its ships are getting targeted in Bab el-Mandeb, and Yemen's Ansarullah are not backing down at all in the way that they're attacking these ships. They're being very ruthless in their ballistic missile attacks against these ships, and extremely precise, because it appears as if the Iranians are providing them with intelligence that they may be using Iranian satellites, that there is a target bank that the IRGC could be helping Ansarullah with. So if that is the case, and it's very likely that that could be the case, then that explains why these ballistic missile strikes have been so devastating. And they've killed hundreds of the Saudi-backed forces inside of the country so far, which again is something that is worrying the Saudis. These are some, this is satellite imagery that came out showing some of the destruction from Yemen's drone attacks last week on the Jazan oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. Now, what they're doing, Yemen's Ansarullah, is that Saudi Arabia at this point doesn't even have to bomb them. Simply Saudi fighter jets entering Yemeni airspace is enough to trigger attacks on oil facilities in Jazan and in other areas as well. So as we see here, there's clear evidence of fires burning, and then the previous attacks, we see those scorch marks around the areas where the previous attacks were as well. This is an insane scenario that is completely embarrassing the Saudis. And the Saudis really don't have any way to answer this. They have been attempting to ship in more weapons, to send reinforcements to their allies inside of Yemen. And here, for example, is some footage of ships burning in Mukha port in Yemen, which is right now, at the time of this live stream, in the hands of the Saudi-backed opposition. And it's an important strategic port. So they hit these cargo vessels, and they've done enormous damage to that port and a number of facilities at that port. Of course, this is enraging Saudi Arabia a great deal. And something else emerged on Friday, I believe, that they began taking these territories here in the blue were some of the areas where Yemen's Ansarullah forces entered and captured more territory. It looked like they were perhaps going for an advance to seize the Mukha port area. There are ongoing clashes currently in a number of different locations in the country. And so far, the Saudi-backed forces are taking an utter beating. There's also Marib here, which is further north inside of the country. There's a number of different areas that have been struck and continue to get hit by Yemen's Ansarullah. And what's coming back at them, of course, these are battles. So Ansarullah's forces, the Yemeni armed forces, are taking hits, of course, but they haven't been able to push them back successfully and stop any of these advances. So there's Marib here, and taking this city would be a massive win for the Ansarullah-backed government in Sana'a. If they were to do this, they've eliminated a major hub for Saudi Arabia in the north of Yemen. Again, all of this matters because the liberation of Yemen is going to pose a huge, huge threat to the dominance of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, all of these Persian Gulf Arab nations that are not able to operate independently and are controlled by the United States to a great extent. A independent Yemen would fly in the face of all of this. In fact, they would be the only country, of course, in the Arab world that would be independent at that point and pursue an independent anti-US, anti-Israel policy. All of the rest of them are aligned with the United States, and in many cases, the Israelis are heavily involved in what they're doing. This is another ship that was struck, images that appeared. I believe this ship is near Bab el-Mandeb. So Ansarullah are spotting and hitting with precision attempts by the Saudis to rearm their forces. Anything that moves gets hit with ballistic missiles, with drones. Saudi Arabia is getting hit. All of this is happening, of course, as Donald Trump, again, is claiming that somehow, everything's great. the Strait of Hormuz is open, although we're imposing a successful blockade. Make it make sense. And this is the only way it makes sense. Baghdad Bob. Trump has become Baghdad Bob. Who would have thought, 2003, I guess, was a long time ago now. So that being said, moving on to what's been happening, because there's been, of course, developments, as I mentioned before, in Lebanon. There's a speech given by the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Sheikh Naim Qassem, and he addressed the Lebanese state's position. In fact, it was quite interesting how he debunked and pushed back against the agreement that the Lebanese US-backed government signed to recognize Israel and to permit the occupation of South Lebanon. He simply just quoted an Israeli writer and an article that was written by an Israeli talking about the Lebanese delegation in Washington and how they were pursuing Israel's goals, whether they're simply useful idiots or they're fully aware of it. They are selling their country's interests and they are helping the Israelis. And that's one of the ways during his speech where he spoke about a number of different issues that he chose to outline what was happening. Anyway, a few hours later, after that speech was issued and there were some serious threats made to the Israelis and pledges that they will not stop resisting. And as we've covered on this show, there have been a number of instances where the Israelis attempt to advance upon certain positions and their forces are getting hit by drones. Also, another case where an Israeli military unit began to enter into a building in South Lebanon, and it was detonated by an IED, killed a number of soldiers. So they've been losing soldiers like this. They've been, of course, overly aggressive. They've been detonating civilian villages in the south of Lebanon. And this is just the way that they behave. It was just anticipated that Israel was not going to stop and behave itself, even though it had this stupid agreement that had been signed by the so-called Lebanese government. But this, here we go. This is interesting. They changed the title for the story I was going to bring up here. But nonetheless, we'll pull this up to look at what the Israeli media are saying. So they say the IDF kills 11 in southern Lebanon after 3 Israeli soldiers seriously wounded in Hezbollah attack. So the way that Israel played this off is that they had come under attack all of a sudden from Hezbollah, and they struck back valiantly and defended themselves. And this had nothing to do with them advancing and trying to conquer more territory in the south of Lebanon, which of course is nonsense for anyone who knows anything about this issue and Israel and the way that it behaves. But of course, Israel did commit a massacre. They killed mainly civilians. They claimed to have taken out a official in Hezbollah in its military wing, but the vast majority of casualties in South Lebanon as a result of their strikes were, of course, women and children, civilians, not hitting a military facility and killing Hezbollah fighters, as they claim that this is, their main target is to just target fighters. Regardless, what truly happened is, let's pull up this map here. So Israel attempted once again to capture the al-Taher Hills area. This map is actually incorrect. So I'm going to pull this up on Google Maps, actually. The map is actually, and I'll point out where it's incorrect, because this here, Kafr Tibnet, this is actually above the Litani River. Anyway, I don't know. I don't want to use an inaccurate map. So let me pull up. Okay. Yeah. All right. We'll just use this. So this area here is the al-Taher Hills. So Israel wants to capture this area here. The reason why they want to capture it is because it's known to be a base inside these hills for Hezbollah, where historically they're believed to have stored ballistic missiles and other kinds of munitions. There's a whole narrative that the Israelis have painted about al-Taher Hills and how they've surrounded it, and Hezbollah fighters are, trapped inside of it. I highly, highly doubt these narratives, just simply because the idea that they don't have exits and entrances from different parts of a facility like this is highly unlikely. But they attempted again, I believe, to come from the east this time to make an advance. And they did it with a special forces unit. And predictably, what happened, and this has happened every single time, I believe Israel has tried to capture al-Taher Hills now 7 different times. They've tried to infiltrate and make moves on it. Every single time, Hezbollah smashes their forces. In this case, they hit a vehicle, I believe, that had, what they say, 3 different fighters were wounded. Israeli soldiers were critically wounded, or critically and seriously wounded. We don't have any updates on their health, of course. This is the way that Israel reports. They claimed initially that a drone had hit it. There were other reports that an anti-tank guided missile had been fired and hit the military vehicle that they were traveling in. Regardless, they were hit in this area, which resulted in them going psychotic and deciding to fire a whole bunch of munitions at civilian areas. Then they displaced families in Nabatea because they were indiscriminately bombing, and they were struggling. Here you can see just footage from some of the clashes that took place. But because of this, because of the way that they were ambushed, again, it was difficult for them to evacuate their forces. In the past, it had been so difficult, and Hezbollah's fire was so heavy that they physically couldn't reach their soldiers, and their soldiers, of course, were burned to a crisp inside of their military vehicles. So yet again, Hezbollah resisted an attempt to capture the al-Taher Hills, and Israel is so salty about this and their constant failures that Israel just wrote this whole incident off as if somehow this was a attack on their forces and that they did not initiate this, before talking later on during the day about, yeah, we need to capture these strategic hills. So their whole focus of their military and their media was on capturing this site in the day ahead of the strike, the retaliatory strikes, the defensive attacks of Hezbollah against their special forces unit. So that special forces unit, from what the Israelis admit, 3 of them were seriously or critically wounded, and they are still being treated. They're hospitalized. We don't have any follow-up information, and there's very likely that more than just that were injured. And their response, of course, was to completely disregard of the ceasefire. And, the Israelis don't actually care about the ceasefire. They will attack the Lebanese army in areas that's supposed to be these, deconfliction zones or, experimental zones, whatever they, like to call them. Just ridiculous results of an agreement by a corrupt administration in Lebanon that just simply works on behalf of the U.S. So much so that a recent amnesty bill was passed in Lebanon that will allow, under this bill, and this is why it has so much opposition, for fighters who were captured, Syrian fighters who fought against the Lebanese army, who are in prison right now, for them to potentially be released and to have their sentences reduced. Some of them will be released back to Syria. And these are people that have killed hundreds of Lebanese army soldiers, right? These are the sort of moves that the Lebanese state makes, and they don't care. They simply don't care at all. And, they have a stupid explanation for absolutely everything they do. Oh, well, this heals the relations with the Sunni population. Nobody was saying that you have to release a whole bunch of fighters who killed hundreds of Lebanese army soldiers in order to mend relations with the Sunni population. I mean, what sort of nonsense? Anyway, that being said, Hezbollah are not backing down. It is likely that we're going to see an escalation. This is a video that was released. We're going to take a look at this. That is threatening the Israelis. They use a segment of Sheikh Naim Qasim's speech. Naim Qasim is the Secretary General of Lebanese Hezbollah. And this is a video that was released.
ولذلك واجهنا مواجهة.
So we have to take the audio off of this, or else we'll get flagged here on YouTube. So he's saying that they'll persist with their weapons. Whoever bets on surrender is merely betting on a mirage. For us, this war is an aggressive existential war. And therefore, we have confronted it with a Karbala'i confrontation. That is a reference to the historic Battle of Karbala, which is when the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, Hussein, was martyred by the army of Yazid in Karbala in Iraq. And so the Prophet's grandson being killed with a small number of his companions, of course, especially for the Shia Muslims in Islam, this is a sort of focal point of their ideology and what sort of drives their resistance for many of these different Shia groups, Hezbollah included, of course. So when he says a Karbala'i battle, he means like a battle that they'll fight to the very death, to the last drop of blood. And this is reflected in the speech. And these are here the words of Naim Qasim, and we'll check out the rest of the video. So he says, "We do not accept surrender. We will remain standing steadfast. We do not accept the violation of our country in any way, nor do we accept that the blood of the martyrs be in vain. Our martyrs have placed a sacred trust upon us, and we will safeguard it and continue upon it. Our martyrs are the honorable standard for Lebanon and the Palestinian cause. Our people are the crown upon our heads. We will sacrifice our lives for you and fight to the very last drop of blood." And here there's some FPV drone footage hitting those Israeli soldiers like we saw before. And this is old footage from the recent war with Israel, of course, that you're seeing here on screen. And this speech, what it's broadly been interpreted, that's the Radwan forces, the patch that was on that fighter's arm there. That's the elite units of Hezbollah here, this patch that's on this fighter's arm, just so everyone's aware. And he's saying, yeah, despite the pain, we are continuing. Falsehood may have its moment, but the truth will have its final victory, inshallah. So God willing. And now you're seeing more footage of them hitting an Israeli settlement here. I think that was Kiryat Shimona from memory that they hit. So that's the footage that we have from Hezbollah that they released. It appears as if we're on the verge of a escalation once again between the Israelis and Hezbollah. Temporarily, we saw that what Hezbollah did, instead of doing its daily first-person view FPV drone operations against the Israelis and taking out their forces on a regular basis, and they would release the footage from these operations, also using their anti-tank guided missile systems and other means to resist the Israelis, which we got quite a bit of footage of on a daily basis. They stopped doing that. And of course, they've abided by the agreement that was struck not by the Lebanese government, but really there was a reality imposed by the Iranians, because the Iranians had pressured the United States to stop, number one, Israel hitting Beirut, and then stop the Israelis from continuing to hit civilian centers in the south of Lebanon and allow for around 350,000 Lebanese from the south to return to their homes. From the perspective of Hezbollah, and this is something that you would, this was communicated in the speech of Naim Qassem, was that they don't see the government's agreement whatsoever with the Israelis as legitimate. They don't think about it, and it's not part of their calculations. Instead, for them, it was Iran that secured these sort of temporary arrangements inside of the country. And that is true. The Lebanese government didn't secure anything. If anything, it's secured an agreement where it's attempting to hand over more land to de facto Israeli control, because there were areas in South Lebanon under the document that was signed between Lebanon and Israel, or the US proxy regime in Beirut and Israel, that were not even under the occupation of Israel yet. And they said that we're going to clear them out. And basically they want to get the Lebanese army to do Israel's dirty work in clearing Hezbollah out of the area, which won't work, quite frankly. There was a 15-month period during which Hezbollah was supposed to not been in the south at all. Israel was carrying out near daily assassinations. It was killing members of Hezbollah and civilians, of course, as it does. For 15 months, it committed more ceasefire violations in that period, 15,400, than have ever been committed during any conflict ever in recorded human history. And they still weren't able to clear Hezbollah out from South Lebanon. And still now, you'll see these maps, and I can sort of highlight it here, just pulling up this map. So the Israelis say they have this presence in the south around this zone. It goes up here. And then there's this little portion of territory which they've sort of penetrated above the Litani River, as it's called. And, the Israelis make a big stink about the Litani River. This is like as if it's a huge strategic, gain for them to go here, which is Beaufort Castle. They made a big stink about taking that. And really, realistically, if you look at the borders of occupied Palestine, they didn't actually get that far. And it's not like they crossed the Litani River, coming from the side of like Naqoura and taking Sur, Tyre, and these different areas, right? They didn't pass the Litani River there. What they did is they picked the shortest possible route, crossed it to secure a symbolic victory. And if you were to look at those old maps of the occupation of South Lebanon, this is roughly the zone that the Israelis were operating in, right? They've now set up a military base, which they're constructing in Khiyam, specifically around the infamous detention facility where they would torture people in South Lebanon in this detention facility in Khiyam during their occupation until the year 2000, when Hezbollah kicked them out. Of course, the Lebanese government didn't kick them out. They weren't responsible for that. That was the Lebanese resistance that did that, not them. But the Israelis, they want to move deeper into South Lebanon. They want to have more of these, what they, believe are these strategic victories for them. And it's rather pathetic because they haven't been able to push forward very far. What we have heard, this is from some Lebanese media sources, nothing official from Iran yet, but that is that Iran could intervene if Israel makes a major push to take al-Taher, those hills there. Of course, I'm inclined to believe that the IRGC may actually start acting if Israel decides to really pick up the heat, and we see some major moves from the Israelis, because they don't want to see Hezbollah fight on their own. They would rather unite the fronts, and that's something for them that is very important, to ensure that all those fronts are together, that they are united. That being said, there is also these reports that have just come forth that have been circulating today about an attack that occurred on the prime minister of the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq, or Iraqi Kurdistan, Masroor Barzani. They say that there was an attempt to kill him, that they attacked his office. And of course, the United States came out and condemned this. This was a big issue. They said that there were 2 Iranian drones that were used in this attack. And then earlier, what we had today was that the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, publicly condemned the act, and that has now sparked a lot of questions around what exactly has happened here. Many people are calling this a false flag. I interpret it one of 2 ways. Here's, by the way, Iran has continued to blast Kurdish Iranian opposition factions backed by the United States and the Israelis in northern Iraq. Here's some more footage of munitions falling in northern Iraq. And this was over the past few days. There's continuous attacks that have occurred. Iran is continuing to attack the north, targets around Erbil and also Sulaymaniyah. But this specific attack, it could have been potentially a false flag. That's one of the options, of course, that it could have been a false flag attack. And it could be a means of trying to pressure the Kurdish leadership in northern Iraq to act, to become more proactive, and to encourage factions to fight against Iran, to be, or to allow more action. So, there's things that can be done sort of under the table. And I think that could have been pressure. That's one argument. The other argument is that Iran is actually playing a game where they're explicitly threatening them. This is something that I believe could be the case if there was an attempt to use Kurdish forces, proxies of the United States, to invade Iranian territory and to inflict a blow on Iran, which I don't believe would be successful. I think it would be an utter disaster for the Kurdish forces, and not just those Kurdish groups in particular, but other Kurdish groups that are based in northern Iraq. There's a chance that Iran would act against that Kurdish regional government. This is an assessment that I've heard from a number of different sources that I have in the region. So it's plausible both ways. I don't know precisely how to assess it. There is a possibility of a false flag. I believe very much so that the Israelis and the Americans could very easily pull something like this off. It's not very difficult for them to do something like that. But Iran could also be trying to send a message, because if it wanted to assassinate someone in northern Iraq, it could absolutely do it. It does have the ability to carry out an assassination of that nature. So it could be a message. That I do not know. I can say, honest hand and heart, I have no idea which way that goes. Something else I wanted to pull up, though, is that we've spoken a lot about what Iran has been doing in the region, about its allies, and the way that they've sort of put a chokehold on the United States and the Israelis in the region, how they've been taking care of different issues. We've investigated this quite a bit. One of the other issues, though, is what the United States has been doing in the meantime, because a lot of people have sort of requested, well, you speak a lot about what Iran is doing. What is the United States? What's its game? Is there anything that it's doing that it's trying to get behind to punish Iran? And realistically, the number one thing that I think, and this will be a sort of segue into, let's say, some of the history here and explaining these issues in a little bit more depth. But one of the key points of the United States now is that, along with the Israelis, they want to disarm the regional resistance. Now, this was something that has been spoken about for some time. That's been pushed forward by the likes of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the Washington-based think tank, which is widely regarded as the think tank wing of the Israel lobby in Washington, along with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. These think tanks are, they historically have pressured the United States into going into wars like the Iraq War, but they are designing those policies for the likes of the Trump administration. And they have been obsessed with disarmament of all of Iran's allies. And this is something that you will see across all fronts. So if we take a look at this, Hezbollah disarmament, integral to Lebanon-Israel security process. The U.S. tells the Post, this is the Jerusalem Post, right, the pro-Israel rag. This agreement that had been struck by the Lebanese government, that is a proxy of the United States and Israel, they're making it so that the agreement hedges upon Hezbollah's disarmament. That's one part of this. Then you have here, and this is completely irrelevant, and this will never happen. There's even less chance of this happening than any of the other fronts, quite frankly. Yemen's Ansarullah is not going to disarm because it is the army of Yemen. Like 2/3 of the armed forces of Yemen sided with Ansarullah, but they say Yemen's leader, which we've covered before, you can refer back to the other episodes. Just a brief overview. This guy right here, who the chairman of Yemen's, and sometimes they call him the Yemeni president, right? Rashid al-Alami. So this guy is basically just some uncle that, was recruited in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Saudi Arabia in 2022 as part of this Yemeni Presidential Leadership Council, which replaced the so-called internationally recognized president of Yemen, who ran in an election set up by an agreement that was struck in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, put together by the Gulf Cooperation Council, where the former president preceding this guy, President Hadi, Abdrabuh Mansour Hadi, he ran in an election where he was literally the only person in the election. It was not Hadi versus someone else in the election in 2012 in Yemen. It was Hadi, yes or no. That was all. That's what it was, right? So this moron, of course, is parroting what the United States wants him to parrot and what Saudi Arabia want him to parrot. He's now talking about disarmament because against all of the allies. So we've got Hezbollah here with the so-called government of Lebanon. We've got the internationally recognized hotel government, Saudi hotel government of Yemen here talking about disarmament. And then we have, of course, in Baghdad, also the leader of Iraq currently, meeting here with Tom Barak, who's infamous now for being in the Epstein files and having some very questionable things that were communicated back and forth between him and some others. I'll let you go and investigate that for yourself. Make your own decisions as to what you believe he was involved in. But the Iraqi prime minister has been pushing for the Hashid al-Sha'bi the Iraqi resistance to disarm and to hand over all its weapons to the Iraqi state. And now what they've done is in Iraq, they've painted this as this is an anti-corruption thing. They want to, bring all the weapons into the hands of the state. A state that was created by the United States, number one, this system that we have now. And if you wanted, I'll just put this out there, if you wanted to take and arrest every single corrupt official in the Iraqi government system, there would be no government. If you want to nitpick at all of them, like this government and all of these officials, quite frankly, like who's going to be left? Like a handful of people. Most certainly, right? So this whole thing, it's the United States. They want to disarm them. Why do they want to disarm them? Because they care about Iraqi sovereignty, the country that invaded Iraq and overthrew its government and destroyed the country and introduced massive sectarian violence that led, of course, to their best buddies in al-Qaeda and then Daesh taking over large swaths of the territory, 1 million people dying, hundreds of thousands of people starving to death before that with sanctions, millions more fleeing the country in a massive refugee crisis. They care about sovereignty in Iraq. They're spearheading a move to restore the sovereignty of Iraq. No, what they're doing is they want these militia groups disarmed. Why? Because these militia groups, that belong to the Hashid or the Popular Mobilization Units, were formed to fight ISIS and destroy ISIS in the country. And Iran was largely behind most of those groups that emerged. And they coordinated even with the groups that weren't theirs, right? So there's different factions which aren't as loyal to Iran or on and off in terms of their loyalties, which I won't sort of get into too much there in Iraq. But these factions were created to fight ISIS and destroy ISIS and defeat them, and they did. Okay. Now, there's many criticisms against them and different things that happened during their battles against these fighters. That's something that, of course, there is many people that talk about that. There are certain cases of exaggeration to stir sectarianism, but of course there were bad things that were done, which I won't get into. But that's why they're there, because Iran helped create them to fight ISIS, because ISIS posed a threat to Iran. And Iran wanted influence as well in their neighboring country. Who could have guessed that would happen? So Iran then armed all of these people in neighboring majority Shia, also Iraq. And the United States had initially come in and overthrown a government which was headed by a Sunni president. Now, all of this Sunni Shia stuff beforehand was actually not relevant to Iraq. It is today, of course. We talk about this sectarianism and all of this stuff today because the Americans made it a thing in Iraq, but it wasn't before. But just so everyone knows, Iraq is majority Shia. So these Shia militia groups popped up, some of them Christian and some of them Sunni in the Hashid. It wasn't just all Shia, but majority Shia. And they fought and they defeated ISIS on the ground. Now, the US wants to claim that it defeated ISIS because it did some airstrikes at different times. That's about all the US did in the contributing to fighting ISIS, right? And there's a lot of questions about all of these ISIS guys. Well, one of them, Abu Muhammad al-Julani or Ahmed al-Shara, now just so happens to be a US allied president of Syria all of a sudden, right? And he was in US detention in Iraq, and he was also a commander in Daesh. So, put one and one together. Perhaps we'll get more into that actually. But they want to disarm the Iraqi factions because they support Iran and they have weapons and they will fire on Israel and they'll attack Saudi Arabia, right? And they'll be part of this strategy in the region. And of course, the United States don't want that. So they're pressuring the Iraqis to disarm. That's another part of this, right? So Iraq, disarm the PMU and disarm Hamas is the final one, which we'll get into that and some of the different elements of it. So they want to disarm Hamas and all the Palestinian factions in Gaza. They want to disarm the PMU, the Iraqi factions that are allied with Iran also. They want to disarm Ansarullah, right, in Yemen, and they want to disarm Hezbollah. And it's all happening at the same time after a push from the major neoconservative think tanks in Washington, D.C., are all Zionists. Okay, so it's very clear that what is happening here is an attempt to try and isolate the region. And now you have all of these agreements being struck, like Saudi Arabia signed an agreement with Turkey and Pakistan, and they're making a big stink about all of this stuff. And ultimately, you've got a NATO nation aligned with 2 US allies. So is that a threat? No, of course not. It's not going to be a threat. But the Israelis don't like this too much, because any sort of bloc which in any way will be slightly outside of their sphere of influence, they don't like this. They oppose it. They want to, attack these countries. So they're like that. But for the US, who sort of manages Israeli power in the region, that's its role, they want all of these groups disarmed, all disbanded. In the case of Ansarullah, Ansarullah is not the Houthi rebels. 2/3 of the Yemeni armed forces sided with them. The majority of the Yemeni armed forces sided with them, which means they are the Yemeni army. Okay? They're not an armed group. They're not a band of rebels. That's not who they are. They operate a government. After a revolution in Yemen, that's who they are. And of course, if we want to get to the meat and the bones of all of this, if you look at what's happened, for example, in the case of Iraq right now, they also want to disarm them. Saudi Arabia and the US together participated in airstrikes on Iraq. It's Saudi Arabia and the US, and by the way, the Israelis are always behind all of these actions, and the Israelis are involved here. Just because Saudi Arabia doesn't have formal, publicly announced relations doesn't mean that it doesn't favor them, and their intelligence agencies aren't all over this stuff and participating in plots against Yemen and against Iraq. But they're very much involved. So they want to try and manufacture this situation. And you have to ask yourself, the Iraqi groups, they were created as a result. Again, the US overthrows a government in Iraq. It places a confessionalist government in control. It ensures maximum corruption in that system. And then it pressures and owns all of these, through its soft power mechanisms, its NGOs and all of that. It controls Iraq. It controls Iraq through the cash flow that it injects into the country. All elements inside of Iraq, the US have an enormous influence on it. It's not just a military presence that's there. So these Iraqi groups that have popped up, religiously inclined, a lot of them owe their loyalties to Iran. And the US hates that, right? That gives Iran more power, more sway, the ability to suddenly tap into hundreds of thousands of Iraqi fighters who will fight on the side of Iran. That's not something that they want. So the guys that defeated ISIS, you want to take away their weapons to make sure that you can monitor everything they're doing and they can't resist. Because the Iraqi government is never going to resist. At the end of the day, look, when Saudi Arabia and the US bombed Iraq, when the US fighter jets are above their airspace, they don't do anything. They don't even issue weak condemnations. The condemnation that Prime Minister Zaidi issued after the Saudi-US airstrikes on his country, part of that was blaming groups from inside his territory for launching strikes, not threatening the US and the Saudis. Of course not. Of course, it's not going to happen. And if you look at the entire region and what's happened, this is sort of a good segue to get into all of these details. If you look inside of the region, Saudi Arabia is a hub for US plots against the region, and always has been. Not only the US, the British as well. But what Saudi Arabia has managed to do, and this is why you'll hear lots of opposition from groups of people from the region, from West Asia, who absolutely hate, with a burning passion, all of the Shia groups. They normally maybe make an exception for the Palestinian groups because they're Sunni, and some of them just outright curse the Palestinian resistance because they ally themselves with the Rafida, right, with the Shia. And so what had happened here is, even if you look historically at the development of the group that we call the Houthis, right, in northern Yemen, the whole reason why their revivalist Zaydi Shia movement emerged was because in like the 80s and the 90s, in particular, but also before that as well, the Saudis had invested an enormous amount in pushing Wahhabi Islamic doctrine on Yemen. Of course, when the Zaydi movement headed by Hussein al-Houthi emerged inside of Yemen in the 90s, they went even more, hardline. They doubled down on their support for introducing these ideologies. And the Wahhabi ideology is by far the most divisive ideology in the Islamic world. So this is the same ideology, by the way, which was used in not only in Yemen, but was pushed in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan in order to use and to recruit the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviet-backed government inside of Afghanistan. And this was nothing to do with anything religious. The US and the British, of course, were involved, and the Israelis had their own role in some way, but mainly the British and the American intelligence in Afghanistan. They wanted to force out the Soviets. So what they needed to do is recruit these people who developed this more radical, hardline, black and white, everything anthropomorphized sort of doctrine of Islamic thought. And they needed to push this. And of course, what happened in Afghanistan resulted eventually in al-Qaeda and in the Taliban. Taliban are, a little bit different from if you're looking at al-Qaeda, for example, right? Which maybe we'll go into in an episode if it's relevant for talking about Afghanistan. But in Yemen, they pushed this ideology as well on the population. And of course, it's not just Zaydi Shia. There's the majority of the population are Sunni in the entirety of the country. They didn't just push it in the north, though, against the Shia. They pushed it before as well, this ideology, and they invested a lot of money into institutions to indoctrinate people in South Yemen. In specific, between, I think, 1970 to 1990 was the People's Republic of South Yemen. And for people who don't know, the People's Republic of South Yemen was the only ever Marxist-Leninist state in the Middle East. So that represented, of course, a threat to the United States. They didn't like that. And of course, the Gulf didn't like that as well. But this is why the Saudis invested in trying to recruit people into this Wahhabi mentality. And again, with the Wahhabi mentality, it disregards often much of the scholarship, or nitpicks from that scholarship if it does cite it, throughout the 1400 years of Islam. So, well, the vast majority of Islamic history neglects or rejects a lot of the notions that they promote. They simply will find an issue, depending upon what the political climate is at that time. They'll find an issue, and then they'll be able to get their adherents to this Wahhabi ideology to point to all of their fellow people surrounding them, or then the target population, and deem them as kafir, right, as disbelievers, and say that they've committed a number of different sins in Islam, and that as Muslims, people who were born into a Muslim background, that they are worse than others, right, who are outside of the Islamic faith, because they should have known better, and that they have sinned, and that they have de facto made themselves disbelievers, and so they have left the religion, and then what they apply to them is the most hardline standard. So these people are very strict normally in their belief systems, and the idea here is to get people to turn against movements and governments that are fighting against the United States, that are pushing back against the United States. If those are governments or movements that in the past had aligned themselves with the Soviet Union, then we need to fight them because they're disbelievers and the communists, blah, 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 right? Or in this current day and age, the Shia and their horrible Shia, expansionism, and Iran and their fire worshippers and all sorts of stuff that they use. And this goes all the way back to when this ideology was created. And I've touched on this a little bit before, but the sort of founding figure of the Wahhabi ideology, Wahhabism, it sort of comes after him, is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was alive in the 1700s. And what happened is he teamed up with the Saudis, right, the family, who then named Arabia after themselves. And they used this ideology, which at the time what they did is they picked practices of the local Muslims that were in what's now Saudi Arabia, right? In Mecca and Medina, in the entire area. They took over what's called Najd, the Najd region in what's now Saudi Arabia. And the ideology they used to justify their violence was that these people were basically committing idol worship. And they were committing very specific actions, like going to the prophet's grave, right, and asking the prophet for something, and all of these different things that in Islam, they argue that this takes you out the fold of Islam, this makes you a non-believer, and then because you're a non-believer, and it couldn't be that you were ignorant, because in Islamic thought, what happens is if somebody doesn't know and they're doing something, that is believed to be wrong, you can just say, oh, they were ignorant of something. So you give them an excuse. You're supposed to give them the benefit of the doubt, basically. These people, they used the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in order to basically conquer territory. It was a justification. So what ended up happening is eventually they used this as a justification, fighting against the Ottomans, to ally themselves with the British. This was something that, again, it helped in the conquering of Palestine by the British and led to the partition of the region, Sykes-Picot and all of these things. It's part of that parcel. I'm not saying it's the only reason, far from it, right? And I'm not trying to say that the Ottomans were perfect or whatever. That's far from it. But historically speaking, this ideology was used in order to justify expansionism, justify allying yourself with the West, justifying seizing power and killing people who are fellow Muslims inside of the region. That's what it enabled. That's what this ideology enabled. And so then, and that's why I say this is nothing about religion. And all of these people that come forth and tell you this stuff about Muslims, how bad the Muslims are and all of this terrorism and extremism, most of the stuff that you would reference as the extremist stuff that you don't like from Muslims comes from this, or these factions with this ideology, quite frankly. And who's behind them? Well, in this case, in a modern context, not having to go back, a long way, but more recently, the Saudis are behind pushing this ideology on Yemen, which of course made the Zaydi revivalist movement, which later, we now call the Houthis, Ansar Allah, possible. They did it in order to push back against socialists and communists inside of the Middle East back during the Cold War. And they use this in order to divide societies and to fight. And what they do often is you have many of these people that adhere to this Wahhabi ideology who also are, of course, spokespeople de facto for the Gulf monarchies. And so what they advocate for is, you could say all those things that they're accusing other people of doing. Hey, the Gulf monarchs are not any better here. But for them, they are the Muslim leaders in this ideology. And so you can't question them. Easy get out of jail free card. But that's what all of this brainwashing does. So for example, in the lead up to the war in Syria, Saudi Arabia was investing specifically in the more rural areas of Syria. It was investing in building its own mosques, introducing its own institutes, stuff like this. It wanted to push its ideology in Syria, and it continued to do so. The Gulf states did this, right? Because they operate and they push Wahhabism, right, as a doctrine. And the United States is all for this. The US, the British, the Israelis love this. Because what it does is it incites hatred between people in the region. And it doesn't matter at the end of the day if the result is that the other side did something back, which was just as horrible, takes two to tango in a war. But ultimately, the origin of this mess is the United States wanting this to be pushed and to have this division come up. So you divide the Muslim world. And of course, you divide Muslim populations from their Christian neighbors and other sects that exist there. That's what they want. And what does this feed into? Saudi Arabia doing this, right? By the way, it's not just Muslims that have been funded. There are Christian fascists like in Lebanon that were funded by the Saudis as well. And that the Gulf states invest in Lebanon historically when they didn't have any, hope in pushing their Wahhabi ideology. Instead, what they did inside of Lebanon was to go and fund and back fascist Christian militias inside of Lebanon. So it's not just Muslims that they'd be involved in financing extremism with, right? And this is why when I'm talking about the region, I don't ever blame religion for any of this stuff, because what it is political actors who decide ways to manipulate religion to their liking, just the same way they manipulate race or whatever, ethnicity, anything that they can to divide people. That's what they do. For example, the Americans play on the Kurdish movement, right? They like to play on the Kurdish movement. They like to use Kurdish groups in order to achieve their strategic aims in the region, and then they just leave them out to dry and die straight afterwards because they don't care about them, of course. Never cared about them. And so people as well, when you learn more about this and you learn more about the history here, then it becomes pretty clear, the evolution of what we see in the region now, and why all these resistance groups that we currently see are Islamic groups, is a result of history and the changes in history, which the United States has contributed chiefly towards. So immediately, like in the case of Palestine, I'm not saying there's no religious influence at all in the early Palestinian struggle, but in Palestine, you had in the 1920s, during the British rule, you had these sort of urban, I don't know if we can call them exactly elites, but more wealthy people who were part of the Muslim Christian associations, which sort of helped sort of lead the Palestinian national movement against Zionism and the British mandate. And amidst that, you had sort of local, like semi-feudal leaders that were mixed in there, religious leaders that were, but ultimately what ended up happening is the peasants sort of took, like, they were the backbone of the revolts that you would find in Palestine against the British and against the Zionists. And you see this natural evolution of a national movement, a national resistance movement, which within it has many different components that come from all different places. So with the post sort of 1948 scenario, you briefly had the old Palestine government, and you had these figures before like Hajim al-Husseini, who the Israelis love to, cherry pick quotes from him and stuff like that, and his brief affiliation with fascists and stuff like that, these sort of figures. And then afterwards, you really have in the Arab world this wave of Arab nationalism, which in many ways is spearheaded by Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. And Abdel Nasser, interestingly enough, was for a small portion of his life, because it's a young revolutionary, was actually affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. But of course, later on, he would turn against the Muslim Brotherhood. But he is, like, Nasserism, as it was called, sort of was a major factor influencing regional resistance against imperialism, against Zionism. And what Israel did is, of course, an act of aggression against Egypt, and then attacked all of their neighbors as well in 1967 in Operation Focus. Of course, Egypt was never planning to attack the Israelis. They seized the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, Gaza, and they occupied Jerusalem as well. And this, led to a few years later, Abdel Nasser died, right, of a heart attack. And when he passed away, many people were trying to go back to the drawing board, because there were movements like in Palestine, for instance, like the Arab nationalist movement, which was led by a man named George Habash, who is a Palestinian Christian, just for the record, and others as well affiliated with the Arab nationalist movement. But they were, sort of loyal to, Nasser. And when, Nasser fell and eventually Egypt would normalize with the Israelis, there was like soul searching that went on. So George Habash would end up founding the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist-Leninist movement in Palestine, which became the second biggest party in Palestine, with the other group being Fatah. And for some time, the Palestinian cause had such an influence because Fatah and some of the armed actions that it committed, sort of captured the imaginations of the Arab world, especially after the defeat of 1967. And these Arab countries, sort of taking a beating. So you had these movements. By 1982, suddenly, again, Israel's invaded Lebanon, has uprooted the PLO. They were forced, by the way, out of Jordan by the Jordanian regime. They forced the PLO out, Palestine Liberation Organization, which is an umbrella group for all the Palestinian resistance. So the Palestinian resistance, which was composed of Marxists and nationalists primarily, was based in Beirut. The Israelis invade. They besiege them. They forced them to go to Tunisia, to North Africa in 1982. They killed around 20,000 people. Then after the resistance fighters left, the Israelis got their fascist militia allies to massacre civilians, right? Like 3,500 people in Sabra and Shatila camps. Most of them Palestinian women and children, some Shia as well, who were killed, occupied South Lebanon, and after this, again, this is another big event, which sort of got everyone to go back to the drawing board, right? So the resistance had failed in Lebanon. The Palestinian resistance had taken a massive beating. And now you have the answer to this despair, to the question, like groups like Islamic Jihad and Hamas actually recruited a lot of people who were formerly with either the PFLP, a Marxist group, or Fatah, the nationalist group, right? This is just in Palestine looking at it, right? So Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which are the two Islamic groups that suddenly pop up, now suddenly they're resisting. They have an ideology which is, very solid to fight behind. And it's just a natural progression. In the case of al-Qaeda and Daesh, these are inorganic movements that are created by force, by influence, by money, that are forced on populations with propaganda. And this is something that sort of is forced in on many Muslim populations because they want to divide the people. They want to have the people destroyed from within. And so the United States uses its allies in the Gulf in order to sow this division. And again, people don't like you saying this because, oh, don't criticize these. Oh, it's the truth. This is historically what has happened. If it wasn't for this ideology being pushed so much and all of this sectarianism, which comes from well-funded media channels. We talk about Yemen, and I've spoken a lot about Yemen on the show. And the reason why I point out that you're never going to hear the truth about Yemen is because the Arab media won't even tell you the truth about it. The vast majority of the Arab media won't tell you the truth about it because it's based in the Gulf and funded by the Gulf. They're the ones who fund the majority of the Arab language media, the Arabic language media. So they're not going to tell you the truth about Yemen because they've got no interest in doing it. Most of them are implicated. Okay, so, and this is the thing, you will never get told about any of the history of the Arab world. They'll never give you any context for any of these movements. They'll never tell you anything about what their allies are doing in the region, the US's Arab allies, because Israel presents you a map. Let's just pull this up just for demonstration here. Israel presents you the map and goes, look at all these Arab countries and they're surrounding us, right? Look at all these Arab countries. Okay, so let's just take a look. So, not a threat, already normalized ties. Saudi Arabia has had under the tables ties with the Israelis for decades. Forget that. Kuwait, the same thing. Qatar, I believe, has an embassy. Israelis can travel over to Qatar. Bahrain openly has relations with them. Oman, again, it's not hostile to the Israelis in any way, shape, or form. Iraq, the government there, obviously, we know what happened with toppling it and all of that. They don't have openly relations with Israel, but the U.S. will push that government towards doing that. Syria, U.S.-backed government, not threatening to Israel whatsoever. Militant groups inside the country, definitely threatening to Israel. Whether they'll ever actually do anything, question mark. But the government in Syria, it's got a joint fusion mechanism with the Israelis, right? It signed an agreement. It's de facto recognized Israel's existence. It's under this joint fusion mechanism with Israel. Syria plans to have economic projects in the future. Okay, Lebanon recognized Israel. The regime there is pro-Israel over its own people. Jordan recognized and has a treaty with Israel, does trade, and is dependent upon the Israelis now to a large extent. Egypt, the exact same thing, right? Libya, it's more distant, but certainly not a threat. Tunisia, definitely not a threat. Tunisian territory was even attacked by the Israelis when they had the Freedom Flotilla. Tunisia did nothing. They just sort of denied that there was ever a drone attack. Algeria, it's sort of neutral. You know, it's not against. Well, I mean, it will put statements out against them, but it's not going to do anything against them, or very, very unlikely it will ever do anything against them anytime soon. Morocco, of course, normalizes with them. Israel is the second largest weapons supplier to the Moroccans. The Moroccan regime is just very close with the Israelis. Like with the UAE, it's probably one of the closest Arab regimes. What else have you got? Turkey here. Okay, they're not Arab, obviously. They're Turkish, but they have open relations with the Israelis. Okay, they have trade agreements. They never stop the flow of oil, cheap oil, which came from, of course, the Turkish ally Azerbaijan, which its military is supplied with Israeli drones and air defenses, and it hosts Israeli forces and military bases, according to reports, very close to Israel. Azerbaijan, by the way, Shia population. Okay, so it's not just Sunnis. It's not the sectarian thing here. Okay, Iran is the only one here, right? Pakistan, has an open policy where you can't go to Israel, but it's not going to do anything against the Israelis, right? Afghanistan, it's controlled by the Taliban, right? So I'm not going to, it's too far to do anything. Even if it wanted to do anything, it's focused on its own issues. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, open relations. Turkmenistan has an Israeli embassy right near in Ashgabat here, which is like only miles away from the Iranian border. Okay, Uzbekistan. Actually, that I don't actually know too much about their relations with Israel. That's something I need to investigate. Kazakhstan, they've had, out of all the Muslim countries, they're one of the the earliest to normalize with the Israelis, right? Now we're going into the Muslim world, okay? We're going wider out. But in the surrounding region, they're all allies or completely neutral or have under the table negotiations. The only ones are armed groups in Iraq that have fired on Israel and opposed them. Some small, very, very small groups in Syria that will fire on them. And then there's groups in Syria that will chant stuff against the Israelis, but again, their government, is backed by the United States. In Lebanon, Hezbollah resists them, and there's Palestinian resistance, and Iran. Iran is and Yemen, the Yemeni Sana'a-based government, they're the only ones, and they're far away. That's this whole, these crazy Muslims wanting to kill the Israelis. And it's like, if all of these countries surrounding actually were willing to fight Israel, it wouldn't exist today. But they're not. They're all captured. So, when you've got groups like Hamas that emerge in the Gaza Strip and Islamic Jihad and all of these groups that have emerged, this is like, you kill them, you continue to kill them, you continue to massacre their women and children. When they're secular organizations, they're terrorists. When they're Marxist organizations, they're terrorists. When they're Islamic organizations, they're terrorists. It doesn't matter. Every Palestinian party, with the exception of the mainstream branch of Fatah, are terrorist organizations in most Western countries. Which means if there was an election in Palestine, a democratic election in Palestine, the same thing will happen as last time. If tomorrow suddenly, again, Marxism pops up as a popular ideology in the region, and the PFLP or a brand new Marxist group pops up out of nowhere and wins a democratic election in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and maybe East Jerusalem might be somewhat included. Anyway, just imaginary scenario here. They would come, crack down on them, kill them, sanction them. It would be the exact same thing. Like, if you go back and watch Netanyahu talk about the Soviet Union and the PLO and Fatah, right, during the Cold War, everything is like the terrorists of the PLO, and if you defeat the Soviet Union and you destroy the PLO, then peace will return to the world. And now it's Muslim groups, Islamic groups, because you've killed everyone else. And now they've turned back to their religious roots and formed organizations to fight you, to clear you from their lands, to stop occupying their lands. And now you go, oh, it's a Muslim problem. Again, this is why they don't teach you about anything, because they will never pull up on even these channels that claim to be against hatred of Muslims and stuff like that, and all of the rest, and inciting CNN. We're liberal, we're against the hatred of Muslims, continue to push this. They'll never pull up a map of the region and actually show you what populations what and how these groups emerge, why they're fighting, the history of it, who's involved. They can't, because their donors won't allow them to do it, right? That's why we need independent media. That's why we need to look at this, all in its proper context. If you have been on here, by the way, you've got this far into the show, do hit that like button. Please do share this video. We're getting killed in the algorithms. So please do help us along with a comment there. Let us know your thoughts and your opinions. Of course, we'll continue to bring you all of this news and analysis and all of the latest updates as they come in. There's a lot that perhaps that we could get into. One thing I want to actually look at briefly before we go, but I'll just give the reminder beforehand that we're looking for 300 new members. You can join us on Patreon or here on YouTube. So if you want to keep the show going, if you want to keep it alive, then this is completely viewer funded. So we thank everyone who has been joining up, of course. And the show is really by you and for you. So this completely independent media here. But the last thing I want to sort of get into here is this clip. It's emerged from Jared Kushner. He's speaking with the Israelis. They're talking about Hamas disarmament, right? I just want to address this clip, and just so everyone is aware of this nonsense.
A very, very good meeting. We were there for almost 4 hours with him and his team, going through all the different details. I think there were some valid concerns that they raised that we were able to address, and we were able to go through some of the misunderstandings and misinformation that's been.
He's talking about his meeting with the Israelis and with Netanyahu.
Out about it as well. I mean, certain things like we're very committed to the fact that we have a plan to rebuild Gaza, but we will.
By the way, this is something I wanted to pull up and address. He does not have a plan to rebuild Gaza at all. The closest thing that there is in the way of a plan to rebuild Gaza is a Emirati-backed plan that has been put together for this prison city where you have to give in your biometrics and you're monitored by cameras 24/7, surrounded by the Israeli military in Rafah, right? On the top of the ruins of Rafah. And the Emiratis want to invest in this. That's the closest thing, and it's not, there's no proper blueprint for it, but that's the closest thing that they have any plans for, okay? When Kushner is saying this stuff, and I looked into this at the time when he was putting it all together. If you look at all the plans, first of all, he sort of copies an Israeli plan for Gaza and reconstruction. Then what he does is he puts together this weird, like, slideshow. And that's his next best plan. This document starts getting circulated, and the document that's circulated, I believe the Turkish government and some of their officials and others got their hands on it, and it's a bunch of AI-generated images of these skyscrapers and casinos and all this nonsense that is literally no more sophisticated than the stupid, ridiculous AI-generated Trump Gaza video that came out at the start of his presidency of him taking ownership of Gaza and making a casino and, sipping, alcohol with his best buddy Netanyahu, or his owner Netanyahu. It's no more serious, no more sophisticated than that. And all of the things that he's putting, these numbers that he presents for it, suddenly those numbers, when he has to present it to the Board of Peace, his plan, his brochure, his AI-generated images, when he has to present it, suddenly he's cut off tens of millions of dollars in funding of what's needed for these projects. But it's the exact same images that were in these documents that were circulated, which I got my hands on before they came out. The exact same thing. He has no plan. There's no plan. The United States has never had a plan for reconstructing Gaza. And this is something that everyone has to know. They don't have a plan for reconstructing Gaza because Israel is still destroying Gaza right now. It's still bombing. Yesterday, they blew up 8 buildings, in Rafah that were still there. Damaged, they just blew them up just because. They're still destroying all of the agricultural land. In the Gaza Strip, before the war, just so everyone is aware, Gaza, the amount that it produced from its agricultural land in terms of crops and food, it was over enough for the population. It got itself to that point where it was actually sufficient for itself because it had been so badly battered and isolated that it produced enough produce, about 120% of the needed produce. So it had about 20% extra in produce that it could sell elsewhere, right? That's where Gaza was. It had to do everything internally from their own land because nothing was coming in enough to suffice. Their population was extremely poor, could barely afford anything. And so they had to feed themselves, and they turned to their own land to do this. Israel has systematically destroyed all of their land. Why? Why has it gone and poisoned, literally poisoned their land and destroyed everything there? Because they don't want them to live there anymore. They want to ethnically cleanse them. They're just trying to find out a way and an opportunity to push them out. So anyway, let's continue to listen to this idiot.
allow Gaza to be rebuilt until the demilitarization occurs. Nobody wants to put more money into a place that's gone on for so long.
So again, Captain Moron here, who somehow, got through university. Somehow he got through preschool. I don't know why. His family paid off that preschool. The fact that he can pick up crayons is beyond me. Anyway, this idiot, he's claiming now, oh, we spoke to the Israelis and disarmament has to happen before reconstruction and blah, 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 and all of this stuff. And before they withdraw their forces. And so Israel right now, they came back to the Board of Peace. Hamas presented and all the Palestinian factions signed on to an agreement to disarm, right? They want to store their weapons and decommission their heavy weapons as they define them. And ultimately, the Israelis said, no, we can't do that because they need to disarm before we leave Gaza and before we think about anything to do with reconstruction. So Hamas are supposed to give up the only chips they have left so that Israel can not withdraw from Gaza and not even think about reconstruction. And that's what's happening. They don't have any plans for reconstruction. This bozo doesn't know anything about, reconstructing the Gaza Strip. And that's why they've put someone who is as incompetent as Jared Kushner in this role, because he knows nothing about this and he couldn't possibly help. None of these people on this Board of Peace have the expertise necessary to do this job. None of them. And that's by design, because it's not about that. Because the Board of Peace Charter didn't even include the words Gaza or Palestine once. They want to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and they want to disarm all of the resistance groups. So this has been a long-winded way of explaining, by the way, what I was getting to earlier on in the video and wanting to set forth. But this is what the United States and Israel has been working on. They have no other plan. So what they're doing is they're putting maximum pressure on the governing force in Gaza, which is Hamas. They're the only ones with any power there, who are governing Gaza and sort of keeping security for now. They're putting maximum pressure on them to disarm them, to take away their ability to defend themselves, and to rob the ability for there ever to be a Palestinian state that is formed. They're putting pressure on in the West Bank to engineer a situation where the Palestinians will face a massive escalation, and as a result, they get to ethnically cleanse a portion of the population, and they get to double down on their tactics in order to introduce even more settlements into the besieged territory. Right? They're going in Lebanon. They're putting pressure on Hezbollah to disarm. They are threatening civil war, threatening the Syrians intervening. The Israelis are threatening directly war with the Syrians unless the Syrian regime crack down harder on their own people in Daraa and Quneitra and try and steal their weapons away from them so they don't resist when the Israelis come in and steal their towns and steal their water resources and set up checkpoints and decide to bomb their houses if anyone dares to fight back, even with stones. They're going to Iraq. They're trying to disarm the Iraqis, and they're using, again, the toilet regime there. And that's what it is. They're using a bunch of toilet regimes across the region to do their bidding. And they're trying their best to put pressure on all of these allies of Iran. Because if they take out the axis of resistance, which Iran is ahead of, then they significantly weaken Iran in its position in the region. But if these groups emerge victorious, Israel, the Greater Israel Project is done. The US and its power projection in the region is over. And even these Arab Gulf states that have been center stage in backing up the US and all of its goals in the region for decades now, even they will change in the way that they behave in the region if Iran emerges the victor here. We will see a completely different West Asia and even North Africa. Things are going to dramatically change in the neighborhood. And so this is their last-ditch attempt to pressure these corrupt individuals, right, to get rid of the weapons of the resistance. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is here like Baghdad Bob, you know? He's doing his Baghdad Bob thing, right? No problems, everything is fine. The Strait of Hormuz is open. It's open, trust me, bro. Okay, so with that said, if you did get this far into the video, again, please do hit that like button. We will be back on Thursday for another episode of The Target. So make sure you're here, same place, same time, 4 p.m. CST, and we'll be back with the latest, and we'll follow everything as it's happening, all of the resistance videos that come through, all of the advances on the battlefield, everything that's happening. We'll continue to bring you that and all of the relevant context. So until next time, everybody, please do take care. And also, if you did like what you have been seeing or have seen in this episode today, consider becoming a member, and that would help us immensely in this program. So thank you. Until next time.